and welcome to this special episode of Revolutionary Gazette and Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andrew, and today we're going to take a look at the history of the Charleville musket and the early U.S. muskets that were its derivatives. This is a special two-part episode. They're both going to go live at the same time. You catch part one right here, and then at the end of this episode, go ahead and hit the link at the end of the episode and follow us on the Civil War Digital Digest to catch the other part of this episode. The Charleville musket that was first produced in 1717 in France and its derivatives saw service all over the world. And it's of particular importance to the United States because our early muskets up through the model 1842 were direct derivatives and descendants of these weapons. If you take an 1842 Springfield and a 1717 Charleville and put them together, it's easy to see that these two are descended weapons, that there's just been incremental changes throughout the years, taking advantage of new technology, new techniques, new needs, but they're the same basic weapon has just been changed over the years, making this a family. You can see that the 1842 is the great-great-grandson of the 1717. In the US, we give a lot of credence to the Brown Bess, the British contemporary musket of the Charleville, and it did see long service and widespread service, but the Charleville saw an incredibly long, wide range of service, and it's worth looking at. This family of weapons was in use for 150 years. There were somewhere between 8 and 9 million of them made, and they saw service in India, South America, North America, and Europe during all sorts of different wars. As we go through the journey in these two episodes, I hope you come away with a better understanding of this weapon, its place in history, and why it made its way into America, why it became the standard issue weapon here, and you can see why it had such staying power in American service. So come along and let's go ahead and talk about the Charleville musket and its Springfield derivatives. The War of Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1714 in Europe. It was one of the first large modern wars and encompassed almost the entire continent. During the war, the flintlock musket had become standard. However, there was very little standardization amongst the muskets. In the French army, troops were equipped by their colonels at the regimental level. And so there might be variations in calibers, lengths, quality of the musket, and it led to very complicated logistics, and it led to great difficulties in replacing broken weapons. Following the war, the French moved to introduce their own standardized weapon at the same time that the British moved to introduce their standardized weapon, what we would now know as the Longland version of the Brown Bess musket. The French produced at a variety of arsenals, but particularly at Charleville, the 1717 Charleville. This weapon represents the changes going on in European organization at the time, how they approached war. And it shows the end of the medieval feudal-style warfare where lords and important people brought retainers with them to serve under a king and an army. And instead, a modern war, a state-run war with the state in charge of recruiting, of supplying, equipping, and eventually service during the war, in a way that we understand the military today. The French produced some 7.7 million weapons in all the various models of the Charleville during its production run of 1717 to 1840. During that time, it saw service with the French army during the War of Austrian Succession, during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. It saw service during the American Revolution, and it saw service during the Wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Finally, it saw limited service even as late as the Crimean War with some French units. The Charleville's longevity and its length of service, both of the French Charleville and its American derivatives, meant that it was in an incredible amount of places. It's what equipped Napoleon's armies at Waterloo. The Irish Brigade still had 42s at Gettysburg. It's important that this was one of the first examples of a standardized weapon for an entire army, showing the kind of state control and mass production that it was the first taste of what would start to get unlocked during the Civil War and really come to full fruition with the wars of the 20th century on the total war level. Immediately after the War of Spanish Succession, the French moved to create national armories to begin production of their new weapon. In 1717, they began production at Charleville, Maubeuge, and Saint-Étienne of the weapon that we would know as the Charleville. The initial version of the Charleville in 1717 actually looks very similar to the early versions of the Brown Bess in that the barrel is retained to the stock with a retention pin rather than barrel bands. And it's a very long weapon. And it reflects still this emphasis on a bayonet-equipped soldier with his musket kind of being the same length as a pike. It shows this carryover from the wars of the 17th century with the emphasis on bayonet tactics and wanting to have longer reach with your edged weapon. As the French began production on the 1717, they began to make changes over the years. And while they didn't differentiate these changes into different models, historians today have gone back and reclassified the later productions of this as the model 1728 and the model 1746.
The 1728 variant replaced the retaining pins with 3 bands held in place by screws. The hammer mechanism was simplified and the ramrod was replaced with a metal version. In the 1746 variant, the breech of the barrel was changed to have 8 long, flat faces. The retaining bands are simplified and 2 are held in place by friction. The weapon is slightly shorter at 62 inches.
These new versions of the weapon showed how the Charleville would maintain such a status for longevity due to the flexibility of its design. Because it was something that was easy to improvise and improve upon, incremental changes could be made over time and allowed the weapon to stay relevant for far longer than many other of its contemporaries. These weapons, the 1728 and the 1746, were made stronger by making it shorter, by having a more secure way of connecting the barrel to the barrel bands, and by improving the lock system. These weapons, the 1728 and the 1746, hold an incredible place in American history. When George Washington talks about the charming sound of bullets whizzing past his head at Fort Necessity, it's coming from one of these muskets. When Braddock meets defeat at the Monongahela, it's from these weapons. At Ticonderoga, when the 42nd Black Watch is cutting through the Abattoir to get to the French entrenchments and Rogers' Rangers are firing over them, the French are cutting them down with this weapon. At Quebec, when Wolfe and Montcalm face in this epic battle for the fate of North America, it's with this weapon and with the Brown Bess that it's decided. So these weapons, though they're older and antiquated by the time of the American Revolution, have an incredibly important place in American history. The officers who would go on to become leaders in the American Revolution got introduced to the Charleville family of weapons during the French and Indian War by serving against the 1728 and the 1746. And they got the appreciation of its capabilities. The French also would learn from the war, and they would make changes to the 1746, and they would make the version of the weapon that probably had the most direct impact on American history, the 1763 Charleville. The 1763 version of the Charleville sought to incorporate the lessons learned in combat during the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the French and Indian War. The French shortened the musket 2 inches, but they also realized that they needed a more robust musket. They made it a thicker, heavier musket, and consequently it was much stronger.
The 1763 Charleville is 60 inches in length with a 44-inch barrel, but heavier than the previous models. The butt of the stock is simplified, and the barrel breech is more rounded. The ramrod features a trumpet head.
Over time, the French also realized that this musket was probably a little too heavy. After they made about 88,000 of them, they came out with a sub-variant of it, the 1766. It was further shortened, but it was also light. They cut away more of the stock. They streamlined it, they put a new rammer in it, all efforts to reduce the weight of it but retain as much strength as possible.
The 1766 Musket's barrel is thinner than the 1763's and the lock plate is shorter. The stock is streamlined to reduce the weight. The ramrod has a button head which is retained by a spring under the barrel.
In this version, the 1766 subvariant of the 1763, is the weapon that most American troops got to carry during the later part of the Revolution. And it's what became the basis for the American muskets that were used up through the War of 1812. During the American Revolution, the French imported some 100,000 weapons to the United States. By this time, They had come out with the Model 1777, we'll discuss later, but in true European fashion, they decided to offload their obsolete and outdated weapons on an army that could use them to fight their enemy. We know that of the 100,000 imported into the United States, some 90,000 were of either the 1763 or 1766 variants. There were some subvariants that came later, the 1770 and 1771, that incorporated very minor changes into them, where historians have never sought to classify them as a separate weapon. But they are out there and represent the continual incremental change to the Charleville over time. The Models 1763 and 66 muskets hold an incredible place in American history because they were the primary weapon of the Continental Army during the latter part of the war. When the American Army went into Monmouth and had been more equipped by the French Army by this point, most of these troops are carrying weapons like this rather than Committee of Safety muskets or weapons carried from home. And it showed that the Continental Army was becoming a standardized, more professional force that George Washington fought so hard to make. The 1763 and 66 variants continued in service through the early Republic and into the 1790s. This is the weapon that would have been carried by St. Clair at St. Clair's defeat, by the early Legion of the United States at Fallen Timbers. This is what the U.S. Marines would have carried in their early service. This weapon also served as the jumping off point for American arm manufacturers when the U.S. arsenals at Springfield and Harper's Ferry began. So because of that, the 1763 and 66 holds this place in American history as an incredibly long-served weapon, but a vitally important weapon in the winning of American freedom and the service in the early Republic. The next model of the Charleville, the 1777, probably holds the most important place in world history of the French-produced Charlevilles. To show the incremental changes from the preceding models, it was, again, slightly smaller, trying to make it stronger, but its important part was that it was designed to be more efficient to produce. And France took advantage of that, producing over 7 million units of the weapon.
The musket is 60 inches long and includes a 44-inch barrel. The barrel breech plug has 5 short faces, and the front barrel band carries the ramrod retaining spring. The lock plate is flat with a beveled edge forward of the cock and convex with a beveled edge behind the cock. The pan is brass and inclined forward. The cock is convex.
This is the weapon that was carried by the French Army during the American Revolution. It was carried by the French still during the Wars of Revolution, by Napoleon's troops during the Napoleonic Wars, and carried up until the 1830s and 40s with limited use into Crimea. But it was this weapon that had incredible longevity and proliferation. While the Americans under Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette were storming Redoubt number 10 with their 1766 Charlevilles, the French attacking Redoubt number 9 would have had their Model 1777 Charlevilles. Napoleon's troops would have carried this into the steppes of Russia, and they carried it at the Battle of Waterloo. And because of this, the Model 1777 holds an outsized place in world history. And in American history, not only for its service in the Revolution, but because the changes made to it eventually would be incorporated into American weapons following the War of 1812. During the American Revolution, very few, if any, American troops would have had the Model 1777. Because it was the current weapon in French production, it was what their army was still equipped with, it's very unlikely that we ever got more than a handful of these weapons issued to us. Because of this, probably almost no American troops ever carried this actual model of musket, but we chose to talk about it because of its impact and because it still changed American arms manufacture down the road. But it also marked an important transition because now we're going to talk about weapons made in America by Americans. The first muskets made in the United States following the end of the American Revolutionary War are what today are called the 1794 contract muskets. However, made in the United States is a little bit of a misnomer. These weapons were actually French models, 1763, 66, or the 70 or 71 variants on them that were still in U.S. arsenals but were unassembled. And what the War Department did is they shipped these to various contractors. Now, the contractors took the parts, repaired them, replaced specific parts if they needed replacement to create complete muskets for the US. But again, the majority of these weapons were of French manufacture, shipped to us during the Revolution or directly after, and only assembled in the United States with occasional American pieces mixed in. Overall, the US produced somewhere between 5,500 to 6,000 contract model 1794 muskets, and they saw service with the American Army up through the War of 1812. The 1794 served as an important stopgap from the initial arms that were on hand in America after the American Revolution until the US could set up its own arms manufacturing industry. However, its limited production left the Army in a tough place and meant that the Army needed to start production of its own version, what would become the 1795 Springfield musket. After the American Revolution, there was no government armory that produced weapons for the United States military. What we know now as Springfield Armory at the time was just an arsenal, a place to repair and store weapons, not a place to manufacture them. Beginning in 1795, though, that would change, and the US would move to open production both there and a southern location, what would become Harper's Ferry Armory. The 1795 US musket was based on the 1770 version of the 1766 Charleville. Beginning with the early production of 245 in 1795, it reached a high of over 10,000 per year before production ceased at Springfield in 1816.
The model 1795 was the first American-produced musket and is 59 3/8 inches long. The barrel measures 44 5/16 inches to 44 9/16 inches long. The bayonet lug is on top of the barrel. The lock plate is flat with a beveled edge with a protruding point to the rear. The pan is not integral to the lock plate. The cock is flat with beveled edges and a heart-shaped hole. The tang is recurved with a notch on the front.
There were 4 different variants of this musket, all incorporating small changes, but all still keeping to the same basic structure of the musket. Production began at Harper's Ferry in 1801 on the musket. However, the model they used was most likely a 1794 US contract musket, so there are numerous small variations between the Springfield and Harper's Ferry variants of the musket. Production continued at Harper's Ferry until 1819 when they switched production to the model 1816 Type 1. The 1795 is the first major US weapon produced. There's over 100,000 examples of it made, and it went on to serve the US Army all the way through the War of 1812 in primary service. This was the weapon that was carried at Tippecanoe. This was the weapon that was carried all throughout the War of 1812. When you talk about Winfield Scott and his brigade and them being called out, those are regulars, by God. They were carrying the model 1795 musket. The 1795 holds an important place in American military history as the first American government production firearm on a great scale. With almost 200,000 made, it still was a copy of a French weapon and didn't really show a lot of original thought. But it set up an American arms industry that would go on by the time of the American Civil War to be innovative and go on to create its own cutting-edge weapons that were technologically on the same level with its European contemporaries. In 1798, America was in a precarious position. That year, we entered the Quasi-War with France, which mostly was a naval war, but also precipitated a large military buildup by the Adams administration. One of the things that became apparent quickly was there were not enough arms to equip everyone. Production on the 1795 Springfield was still slow at Springfield and hadn't even begun at Harper's Ferry. Deliveries of the contract 1794 were behind. Only about half of them delivered at this point. And so the War Department decided that they need to ask for an extra contract weapon. The model 1798 contract weapon is important because it was actually produced in the United States. It wasn't just an assembly of French parts like the 1794. The pattern used for the contract 1798 were contract 1794 muskets, particularly ones produced under the contract by Owen Evans and used as the pattern by all the 1798 manufacturers.
Modeled on the 1766 Charleville, the contract model 1798 shares many of its features. It measures 59 and 13/16 inches long and has a 44 and 15/16 inch barrel. The bayonet lug is on the top of the barrel rather than the bottom as on some of the 1766 Charlevilles. The pan is integral to the lock plate.
They would go on to produce over 40,000 weapons during this contract and would fill a critical shortfall in the American weapons inventories during the late 1790s and early 1800s. This weapon went to serve alongside the 1794 and 95 Springfields interchangeably with them. There's not anything particular about its service other than it filled this critical shortfall in American arms inventories at this precarious moment, because to put this in the world stage, this weapon came on as the French Wars of the Revolution are rising to even larger levels, and it was seeing greater instability on the world stage. France and England were starting to become more aggressive to the United States. The United States realized that it needed to have a more robust military. It needed to have a greater industrial base in order to properly defend itself. And the Model 1798 is a good example of the United States sending that manufacturing out to private makers to supplement what was being made at the federal armories. In early 1808, the US government decided to take the step of federalizing the procurement of arms for the state militia. Consequently, the federal government drastically needed to increase its supply of weapons to give to the states for their state use in the militia. And that led to the Model 1808 contract musket. Model 1808 holds an interesting place in history because it was actually a failure of a contract. The contract was made for only $10.75 a weapon. However, it came in the backdrop of Jefferson's Embargo Act and an economic depression across the country at the time. Also at the time of inflation, which means that the price set for it simply was too low for the manufacturers to make money off it. The manufacturers were given models of the 1795 produced at both Springfield and Harper's Ferry as patterns. So there's variation across all the different manufacturers depending which one they got as their model.
Most are 59 and 3/4 inches long with a 44 and 1/4 inch barrel that features a brass front blade. The bayonet lug was either on the top or the bottom of the barrel. The lock plate is flat with a beveled edge ending in a projecting point. The cock's tang has either a simple rounded top and straight rear profile, or a decorative notch in the front of the cock's tang, and its rear profile is recurved. The pan is integral to the lock plate and has a rounded bottom.
There were supposed to be some 80,000 of this contract made, but somewhere only about 40,000 were made. Many of the makers didn't produce any or very few, again, because they simply couldn't afford to based on the contract cost by the time they went to go produce in 1810, 1811. Many of these makers even sold some of their weapons to rebels in South America because those rebels would pay a higher price for the weapons than the price set by the US government. Ultimately, the Model 1808 was a failure as a contract. The weapon itself was fine, it was functional, it went to serve alongside the other weapons of its era up through the War of 1812, but ultimately it showed that the War Department needed to be more flexible and needed to have better foresight in how they structured contracts and how they went about procuring weapons. Things that they would try to solve with their next model of US-made musket as they attempted to shift more and more production towards the federal armories. And the contract Model 1808 is going to be the last US weapon made before the War of 1812. And consequently, it's the last gasp of American industry to try to get prepared for a war that on so many levels the United States was not ready for. That completes the first part of our look at the French-made Charleville and their American-made derivatives and their impact on American history. Join us over on Civil War Digital Digest to see the completion of this episode by following the link below. For Revolutionary Gazette, I'm Andrew, and we'll catch you next time.